Hans-Jürgen von Arnim had spent his entire life preparing for war. Born into a long line of Prussian officers, he grew up in a world where discipline, duty, and obedience were treated almost like religion. By the time the Second World War began, he was already an experienced commander. When Germany invaded Poland in 1939, during the invasion of Poland, von Arnim led armored units that advanced with incredible speed. The German army seemed unstoppable. A year later, he was again at the center of Germany's early victories during the Battle of France. German tanks cut through Allied defenses and forced France to surrender in just 6 weeks. For officers like von Arnim, it seemed to confirm everything they had been taught about German military superiority. The system worked. The strategy worked. Victory seemed inevitable. But the war did not stay easy for long. In 1941, Germany launched the massive invasion of the Soviet Union known as Operation Barbarossa. Von Arnim commanded armored forces deep inside Soviet territory. At first, the advance was rapid, but the fighting grew harder with every month. The distances were enormous, the winters brutal, and Soviet resistance far stronger than expected. By late 1942, the war was beginning to turn against Germany. The disaster at the Battle of Stalingrad had shaken the entire German command structure. At the same time, another crisis was unfolding far from the frozen battlefields of Russia, in the deserts of North Africa. The Axis campaign there had once looked promising under the command of the famous German general Erwin Rommel. His Africa Corps had pushed deep into Libya and threatened British control of Egypt. But by late 1942, the situation had changed dramatically. After the British victory at El Alamein, Axis forces were forced into a long retreat across the desert. Then the Allies opened a second front in North Africa. In November 1942, American and British forces landed in Morocco and Algeria during Operation Torch. Suddenly, the Axis forces in North Africa faced enemies from both directions. Rommel, exhausted and suffering from illness, returned to Germany. The responsibility for holding Tunisia now fell largely on Hans-Jürgen von Arnim. It was not a command many officers would have wanted. The Axis forces were already being pushed into a smaller and smaller area along the Tunisian coast. Supplies had to cross the Mediterranean from Sicily, but Allied ships and aircraft were making that journey extremely dangerous. Still, at first, there was hope. German reinforcements arrived quickly. New tanks, experienced troops, and fresh commanders were rushed into Tunisia. Von Arnim believed that if the Axis could build strong defensive positions, they might hold the Allies long enough to stabilize the situation. But reality soon proved harsher. Allied air power began to dominate the skies. Bombers attacked ports, roads, and supply depots almost every day. Ships carrying fuel and ammunition were sunk before reaching Tunisia. Some convoys arrived with only a small part of their cargo still intact. Fuel shortages became constant. German tank units sometimes had to remain completely still because there was simply no gasoline left. Even moving a few kilometers could drain the last reserves. Meanwhile, Allied forces continued growing stronger. American troops were gaining experience quickly, while British and Commonwealth units that had fought across the desert for years pressed forward with increasing confidence. Von Arnim studied the reports arriving at his headquarters. Each new message told the same story: fewer tanks, less ammunition, fewer aircraft. The army in Tunisia was slowly losing the ability to fight. Yet orders from Berlin were clear: hold the line. German commanders were told that Tunisia must be defended at all costs. Propaganda insisted that the Axis armies would eventually push the Allies back, but the officers on the ground could see the truth. Tunisia was becoming a trap. German and Italian forces were being compressed into a smaller and smaller area. Every road and every hill became part of a desperate defensive battle. There was no longer room for the fast-moving armored warfare that had once brought Germany so many victories. For Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, the realization came slowly but unmistakably. The war he had spent decades studying was no longer under his control. And somewhere ahead in the desert, an ending was already beginning to take shape. An ending that would involve hundreds of thousands of soldiers and one of the largest surrenders that the war had yet seen. By early 1943, the situation for the Axis forces in North Africa had become critical. What had once been vast deserts stretching across Libya and Egypt had shrunk into a tight, crowded corner of Tunisia. German and Italian units were trapped, pressed from the east by British forces advancing from El Alamein, and from the west by American and British troops who had landed in Morocco and Algeria during Operation Torch. For the first time, the Axis armies faced a two-front threat in the desert, and Tunisia had become the last place they could make a stand. German reinforcements were rushed in from Sicily, bringing fresh tanks, soldiers, and supplies. Initially, there was hope that these reinforcements could stabilize the situation. Commanders worked quickly to establish defensive positions and deploy armored units along the main roads and strategic high points. But Tunisia's geography made everything more difficult. Narrow mountain passes, rocky terrain, and limited roads slowed movement, while every essential supply, fuel, food, ammunition, and spare parts had to cross the Mediterranean Sea, a dangerous route now heavily patrolled by Allied ships and aircraft. Many convoys were destroyed before reaching the coast, and others arrived with only part of their cargo intact. Fuel shortages became a constant problem. German tanks, which had once been the backbone of mobile desert warfare, often could not move more than a few kilometers. Trucks struggled to deliver supplies across difficult terrain, and artillery units ran dangerously low on ammunition. Even when positions were held, the soldiers felt the pressure of the shrinking battlefield around them. Every day brought new threats, and the desert that had once allowed rapid, sweeping movements now felt like a trap. In the air, the Allies held a clear advantage. British and American planes constantly attacked ports, airfields, and supply routes, forcing the Axis to fight on multiple fronts at once. German pilots flew bravely, but their numbers were too few, and reinforcements were slow to arrive, sometimes never reaching the front at all. On the ground, Allied armies continued to push relentlessly. British troops advanced from the east, while American and British units from Operation Torch pressed in from the west. Axis forces were slowly being compressed into a shrinking corridor along Tunisia's northern coast. There were still moments of resistance. German armored units launched counterattacks, including a significant action at Kasserine Pass, where inexperienced American divisions were temporarily pushed back. But each tactical victory came at a high cost. Men were killed or wounded, tanks destroyed, and ammunition expended. Supplies were never fully replenished, leaving the Axis forces weaker after every engagement. Week by week, the trap around the Axis armies tightened. Defensive positions that had once seemed strong became vulnerable. Roads and mountain passes were contested in constant skirmishes, and morale among the troops began to decline. Officers understood that reinforcements were limited and that the Allies were growing stronger every week. The once mobile desert war, which had allowed bold maneuvers and sweeping victories, had turned into a slow, desperate fight for survival. By spring 1943, the reality had become unavoidable. Axis forces in Tunisia faced shortages of fuel, food, and ammunition, a growing number of Allied troops, and overwhelming air and naval superiority. Escape by sea was almost impossible, and retreat across the desert was blocked.
Soldiers and commanders alike could see the writing on the wall. The campaign in North Africa was nearing its end. What had started as a daring desert war had become a slow, inevitable collapse, setting the stage for one of the largest surrenders of the Second World War.
By early 1943, the Africa Corps was no longer the feared, unstoppable force it had been under Rommel. German and Italian troops in Tunisia were exhausted, undersupplied, and under constant pressure from the advancing Allies. The mobility that had defined desert warfare, the rapid armored thrusts, the sweeping maneuvers across hundreds of kilometers, had vanished. Tanks were immobilized by fuel shortages, artillery units often ran out of shells in the middle of engagements, and food was scarce. Soldiers went hungry for days, water was rationed, and medical supplies were limited. The desert, once a vast arena for bold strategy, had become a cage. Morale among the troops was fragile. For years, Axis soldiers had been told surrender was dishonorable, that defeat was worse than death, and that the British were ruthless captors. Yet as days turned into weeks under relentless pressure, the reality on the ground contrasted sharply with the propaganda. Every day brought more evidence that survival, not victory, was the only possibility. Men watched as comrades were killed or captured while their supplies dwindled. Officers tried to maintain discipline and hope, but the mounting losses weighed heavily. The arrival of fresh Allied reinforcements only made the situation worse. German and Italian troops were now well coordinated, supported by a growing number of tanks, artillery, and aircraft. Allied air superiority allowed constant bombing of Axis positions, roads, and ports, making any attempt to regroup extremely risky. Even the command centers of the Axis were not safe from air raids. Every movement, every supply convoy, every attempt to reposition troops risked destruction. The Africa Corps' remaining units fought desperate defensive battles across northern Tunisia. German and Italian troops tried to hold towns, crossroads, and mountain passes, buying time and attempting to slow the Allied advance. Some counterattacks succeeded, briefly regaining lost ground and lifting morale. One armored unit managed a bold strike against advancing American forces, forcing them to retreat temporarily, but every success was costly. Men were killed or wounded, tanks destroyed, and ammunition depleted. Replacement supplies were often delayed, partially destroyed, or entirely blocked by the Allied blockade. Fuel shortages became catastrophic. German tanks could barely move, and many were forced to remain in static defensive positions, their firepower wasted. Trucks struggled to deliver ammunition and food across rugged terrain, often under constant air attack. Even basic necessities like water and medical supplies were scarce, leaving soldiers weakened, dehydrated, and increasingly vulnerable to disease. Every day in Tunisia became a fight not only against the Allies, but against the harsh desert environment itself. Communication with Germany grew increasingly uncertain. Requests for reinforcements and supplies were met with silence or partial deliveries. The Mediterranean, once a supply lifeline, had become a deadly gauntlet. Allied warships and aircraft intercepted and destroyed convoys before they could reach port. Without fuel, tanks could not move. Without ammunition, artillery was useless. Without food and medical care, soldiers were left weakened and demoralized. The army was slowly deteriorating from the inside. By mid-1943, the collapse of Axis forces in Tunisia was inevitable. German commanders understood that sustained operations were no longer possible. The strategic advantage had shifted completely to the Allies, who could replace losses quickly while Axis resources ran thin. Despite fears of dishonor and humiliation, officers began to prepare for the only remaining option, surrender. Soldiers were quietly informed that fighting to the last man was no longer feasible, yet many still clung to hope, refusing to believe that their entire campaign could end in defeat. The only proud Africa Corps, known for its daring desert campaigns and brilliant maneuvers, had been reduced to a trapped and battered army. Positions were lost, supply lines were destroyed, and the pressure of encirclement grew daily. Soldiers huddled in defensive positions, aware that the Allies surrounded them from all sides. Every map, every report, every lost convoy confirmed the same grim reality. The North African campaign was reaching its final stage. By now, the desert had transformed from an open battlefield into a prison. The only powerful units that had conquered Libya and pushed into Egypt were now confined, weakened, and facing an enemy that could replenish its forces faster than the Axis ever could. The soldiers understood that surrender was no longer a possibility to avoid. It was the inevitable conclusion of months of attrition, exhaustion, and relentless Allied pressure. The stage was set for one of the largest surrenders of the Second World War, and the Africa Corps, once the symbol of German desert strength, braced itself for the end.
By spring 1943, the reality of the North African campaign could no longer be denied. Axis forces were trapped in a shrinking pocket along the Tunisian coast. Supplies were nearly exhausted, fuel was critically low, and the desert that had once allowed rapid movement now confined them like a cage. German and Italian soldiers faced a relentless enemy on both sides, with British and American forces pressing steadily from east and west. Air superiority belonged entirely to the Allies, and every attempt to move supplies or regroup risked destruction from planes overhead or warships at sea. Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, the commander who had inherited the 5th Panzer Army after Rommel fell ill, stood quietly in his headquarters. He was 54, a career soldier of Prussian tradition. For decades he had led men across Poland, France, and the Eastern Front, accustomed to calculated victories and disciplined maneuvering. Now, in Tunisia, he faced a campaign beyond saving. His troops were starving, armored units were immobilized, artillery was low on shells, and the promise of reinforcements from Sicily had all but vanished. The Mediterranean was a deadly gauntlet, with Allied aircraft and warships picking off any attempt to send aid. His chief of staff, Colonel Nolte, had already been sent forward under a white flag to find the British lines. The goal was clear: negotiate surrender terms, hand over what remained of the army, and avoid unnecessary loss of life. What remained, however, was staggering. Approximately 275,000 men, German and Italian, trapped and demoralized. This was the largest Axis force in North Africa, now facing an impossible choice. Every German soldier knew the stakes. Nazi propaganda had taught them for years that surrender was the ultimate humiliation. Stories claimed that those captured by the British would face harsh treatment, shame, and betrayal. The officers had instilled discipline and loyalty, emphasizing courage in the face of adversity. But the situation left no room for pride or battlefield heroics. Ammunition had been exhausted, weapons destroyed, and tanks immobilized. Soldiers could no longer fight effectively, and each day only brought the realization that continued resistance would mean death without altering the outcome. Von Arnim understood the delicate balance between survival and honor. He had seen his troops fight bravely across Europe and in the deserts of Libya. He knew the capabilities of the British Army firsthand. They were professional, methodical, and well-equipped. He also knew that further resistance would be pointless. Every defensive line had already fallen. Every attempt to counterattack had failed. Encirclement was complete.
The British forces, meanwhile, approached methodically. Unlike some of the terrifying images painted by Axis propaganda, they moved with order and discipline. There were no mobs, no chaos, only trained soldiers securing positions, preparing to take prisoners, and maintaining order. This calm professionalism was something few German troops had ever witnessed firsthand. For many, it was both a relief and a shock. The enemy they had been taught to fear had not been brutal or vengeful. They were simply soldiers following orders. On the day of surrender, von Arnim removed his field cap, a gesture that carried both personal and symbolic weight. It was a signal to his men that the campaign was over, a quiet acknowledgement of reality in a war that had demanded so much. Men lined up in the desert, weary, hungry, and broken, while British officers documented numbers, equipment, and positions. Despite their fears, prisoners were treated according to regulations, given food and medical attention, and organized for transport. The scale of the surrender was staggering. Over 250,000 men laid down their arms. Ships that could have evacuated some troops had been destroyed or blocked. Aircraft were no longer available to cover retreat. The Afric Corps, once the symbol of German tactical brilliance in the desert, had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. Across Tunisia, towns and hills changed hands with little resistance left to offer. The final signal from the remnants of the Afric Corps was haunting in its simplicity. Ammunition shot off, arms and equipment destroyed, cannot fight no more. For von Arnim, surrender was both a relief and a bitter pill. It preserved the lives of tens of thousands of soldiers who might otherwise have been killed in futile resistance. Yet it marked the collapse of months of planning, years of experience, and decades of military tradition. The British, by maintaining discipline, professionalism, and a steady advance, had achieved something no army had done in North Africa before: the complete surrender of an entire Axis army group without a chaotic rout or massacre. In the desert sun, the vast columns of prisoners marched towards British positions. Their faces showed exhaustion, confusion, and a reluctant acceptance. Some officers maintained their composure, others lowered their heads. It was a moment of paradox, humiliation intertwined with relief, defeat mingled with survival. Von Arnim watched quietly, knowing that history would remember this surrender as one of the largest of the Second World War, a turning point in the North African campaign, and a profound demonstration of discipline and organization by the British forces. The surrender of Tunisia ended the Axis presence in North Africa. It allowed the Allies to secure the Mediterranean, prepare for the invasion of Sicily, and strengthen their position for the campaigns that would follow in Europe. For the soldiers of the Afric Corps, it was the end of a long and grueling chapter, a moment when pride met reality, and the desert, once a field of conquest, became a place of final reckoning.
The surrender of Axis forces in Tunisia marked more than the end of a campaign. It was a turning point in the Second World War. Over 275,000 German and Italian soldiers were now prisoners, the largest Axis surrender since Stalingrad. For the Allies, it was a victory that demonstrated the value of coordination, planning, and superior logistics. For the soldiers of the Africa Corps, it was a moment of bitter reality, the end of months of hardship and the collapse of a desert war that had once seemed unstoppable. The immediate consequence was the complete elimination of Axis presence in North Africa. The Mediterranean was now open for Allied shipping, allowing troops, supplies, and equipment to move freely from North Africa to the next objectives in Europe. This victory gave the Allies control over the southern flank of Europe and prepared the way for the invasion of Sicily and eventually mainland Italy. The strategic implications were enormous, shifting the balance of power in the Mediterranean and weakening Axis influence in the region.
For the men of the Africa Corps, captivity brought a mix of relief and uncertainty. German propaganda had long portrayed surrender as dishonorable and Allied treatment as harsh, but in reality, British forces processed prisoners efficiently. Soldiers were given food, water, and medical attention. Camps were organized to manage the immense number of captives, and officers tried to maintain discipline and morale within their ranks. Still, the emotional weight of surrender was heavy. Men who had fought across the deserts of North Africa, often under extreme heat, starvation, and constant threat, now faced months or years of imprisonment, far from home and unsure of their fate. The surrender also had profound psychological effects on the remaining Italian forces. Many had already been demoralized by shortages, poor equipment, and the overall collapse of command. Seeing their German allies surrender only reinforced the inevitability of defeat. For Italy, already strained by fighting on multiple fronts, the loss of North Africa was a significant blow to prestige and morale. It demonstrated the limits of Italian military effectiveness when isolated from German support and facing a well-supplied, coordinated enemy. In Berlin, the surrender sent shock waves through the German high command. North Africa had been seen as a theater where German skill, tactics, and mobility could achieve results even against numerically superior opponents. The collapse in Tunisia exposed the vulnerabilities of the Axis: overstretched supply lines, dependence on maritime transport, and the limits of desert warfare when faced with persistent air and sea power. Commanders realized that similar problems could emerge on other fronts if logistics were not properly maintained. The surrender was also a lesson in the human cost of war. Thousands of men had been killed or wounded in the months leading up to the final capitulation. Supplies, tanks, and equipment that might have prolonged resistance had been destroyed or captured. The desert, which had seemed vast and empty, had taken a heavy toll on soldiers' bodies and minds. For the Allies, while victory had been achieved, it was also a reminder that the war demanded patience, preparation, and careful coordination to minimize casualties. Despite the scale of the defeat, the professionalism of the British and American forces was widely acknowledged. They managed the surrender efficiently, avoiding chaos, maintaining order, and ensuring that prisoners were treated according to international standards. This efficiency contrasted sharply with the fears that German soldiers had carried for months. For many, the encounter with the British dispelled the propaganda-fueled myths about their enemies and revealed a disciplined, organized army capable of humane treatment even in victory. The long-term impact of the North African surrender extended beyond the immediate theater. With Axis forces removed from Tunisia, the Allies could plan the next phase of the war in Europe with greater confidence. Control of North Africa allowed them to launch Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily, in July 1943. It provided bases for air operations, ensured secure shipping routes, and removed a potential threat to Allied operations in the Mediterranean. The surrender in Tunisia had ripple effects, shifting the strategic initiative firmly into Allied hands. For von Arnim, the surrender was a moment of complex emotion. On one hand, he had preserved the lives of hundreds of thousands of men who would have otherwise faced destruction in futile resistance. On the other, it marked the collapse of months of planning, years of military experience, and decades of a career built on discipline, strategy, and command. He witnessed the end of the Africa Corps not with celebration, but with the solemn understanding that even the most capable soldiers are bound by circumstance, logistics, and the unrelenting pressure of superior forces. As the prisoners were transported away, the desert returned to silence, the scorched hills and abandoned positions standing as testimony to the intensity of the campaign. For the soldiers of the Africa Corps, the surrender was the end of a chapter defined by hardship, courage, and endurance. For the Allies, it was a step toward victory in Europe. For history, it became a lesson in strategy, logistics, and the harsh realities of war. No army, no matter how disciplined or experienced, can survive when cut off from supplies, outnumbered, and surrounded. The surrender of North Africa was more than a military defeat. It was a turning point that reshaped the Mediterranean theater, boosted Allied confidence, and highlighted both the human cost of war and the limits of even the most formidable armies. The legacy of Tunisia endured as a story of courage, desperation, and the harsh lessons that history demands soldiers learn in the unforgiving sands of the desert.